Welcome to the Rest is Politics Question Time with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alistair Campbell.
NordVPN are sponsoring the podcast this week.
Well, it's very kind of them. And good news, they have just got even safer because each subscription now comes with something called Threat Protection Pro.
And this is some really advanced cybersecurity analysis. So if you'd like me to just break down what this means.
Okay, so if somebody's got NordVPN downloaded, what do they do next?
So open the app, check the shield icon on the menu on the left, toggle the switch on.
Okay, done.
Okay, so you've done that. So now Threat Protection Pro will be doing three things for you straight away. On the web, it's blocking malicious websites, stopping trackers, removing annoying ads. Secondly, it's protecting your files by scanning them as you download them and removing any malicious ones. And thirdly, it's detecting vulnerabilities on your phone, checking whether any of the apps you've got are looking dodgy.
Quite impressive. So if you want to try NordVPN for yourself, go to nordvpn.com/restispolitics, and our link will also give you 4 extra months on a 2-year plan. It is the best discount available. There is no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, and the link is in the podcast episode description box. And Rory, let's get right into the kind of guts of this campaign. A couple of questions here. Alan Robinson, can you give some thoughts about why the overall tax burden was lowest in the 80s and 90s, yet we were not in the current state, i.e. poor NHS, public services, etc.? Was wealth just better distributed? And one definitely for you from Rob, how does Rory square his previous support of Cameron Osborne austerity with his current position that Labour aren't promising to spend enough?
Well, I mean, these are wonderful, wonderful questions. Quick apology for everybody, which is I've just come out of dental surgery. So if I seem slightly demented, it's that I'm all up on anesthetics and strange stuff. But these are the big, big questions in the campaign. And I'm really pleased someone's asked them and nobody is really tackling them. So first question, we get this feeling that taxes were lower in the 80s, but public services were better. The truth of the matter is that actually we're spending 4 times as much on the NHS today in real terms, not including inflation, as we were in 1979. And we're spending twice as much on the NHS as a proportion of our economy. So we're spending, over 10% of our economy on health. So how come we're spending all this money and it doesn't feel like anything's getting better? One big change is obviously demography. So the number of people over 85 has doubled since 1979, and the number of people aged between 18 and 25 has fallen. But people over 85 guess how much more they cost than someone between 18 and 25 to the taxpayer to look after if they go to hospital?
I'm going factor of 6.
10 times more.
Right.
10 times more. So you're almost there. But yeah, so they cost 10 times more. So as we all live longer, the costs get more and more and more. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this question around the tax burden's really interesting because everyone's going to the election saying tax burden's never been so high. And people are saying to me when I tweet out, Labour needs to raise taxes. How dare you suggest we raise taxes because the tax burden's never been so high? The truth of the matter is that something very odd has happened. Again, wicked question to you, but who do you think is paying more tax? Do you think it's people on low and median incomes or wealthy people since 2010, since the evil Tories have been in?
Well,
who's actually increased their level of tax they're paying?
Well, in cash terms, people at the top.
And not just in cash terms.
Is it
in
proportionate as well?
Absolute terms, yeah.
Right.
What's actually happened since 2010 is really interesting. There's been a reasonably dramatic drop in the amount of tax that people on low and medium incomes pay in Britain. So over the last 50 years, obviously the basic rates dropped from 35% down to 20%. We're now paying, if you're on £35,000, so let's say median income, you're paying £2,000 a year less than you were in 2010, national insurance and income tax. If, on the other hand, you are in the top 1%, and again, people struggle to work out what the top 1% is, so I'm going to be mean to you. What do you think the top 1% is roughly of incomes in Britain?
Oh, is it 150?
Good. Yeah, 200,000, top 1%. They are currently paying £10,000 a year more on average than they were in 2010. So oddly, this right-wing conservative government has reduced the income tax, national insurance on median incomes and increased it on high-paid people.
Yeah.
This is because obviously in 2010, the top rate tax was 40%. It's now 45%. They've taken away a lot of the brakes on
So
pensions.
good. By the way, Rory, you've somehow changed your backdrop. Have you got one of those fancy machines?
This is, what with what? No,
Or is this the drugs?
The drugs, the internet's collapsed. I'm now sitting on top of my Wi-Fi. The British tax burden is still, in terms of developed economies, pretty much in the middle. I mean, it's obviously much above the US, but it's well below places like France.
Yeah. That 1%, would that include those very, very bad people who pay no tax at all? The ones who literally are sort of,
I wonder whether they're picked up in the figures.
I bet they're not. I bet that's 1% of taxpayers, isn't it?
Yeah, obviously there's criminals who don't declare their tax. There's people who evade their tax. I mean, there is something very odd going on because the number of people who declare incomes over £1 million is very small indeed. I think in sort of tens of thousands, if that, right? And yet you walk around London, you see all these incredibly fancy cars, all these fancy houses. So most of the tax, not most of the tax, but a disproportionate amount of the tax that's coming in is coming from people in that over £200,000 bracket.
Right. So that's tax. Yeah. Now, to go back to the beginning, Rob wants to know how you square your constant bleating that Labour aren't promising to spend enough with your defence of austerity, which created this mess in the first place.
Well, I suppose the point that I'm trying to make is that actually the current Labour policy, which is to reduce the debt, not increase taxes and reduce spending by about £18 billion, is a form of mini austerity.
Yeah.
And I just think it's something that people need to focus on, and it's going to be very, very painful. Paul Johnson from the IFS keeps pointing out that none of the parties, and I mean none of them, not Labour, not Conservative, not Lib Dems, not Greens, not SNP, not Plaid, none of them are being straight about the money. And it's a glimpse of the blinding obvious. Our public services are in bits. There is a huge amount of bills that we need to pay if we're to get our services up to scratch. And there's not enough money coming in. In fact, on current track, Labour, which I believe is going to be the next government, is going to have to implement some swingeing spending cuts. And the reason I'm a bit worried in the long term is that I don't think that's a very attractive offer to voters, that this socially liberal, fiscally conservative model, which they seem to have adopted, which was sort of the model of Clinton and Blair, was particularly the kind of model of David Cameron, seems a bit out of step with a time when we all think we need much more spending. Or people like me think we need more spending.
Right, very briefly, defend austerity. You still haven't done that. You keep avoiding the real question from Rob.
Well, we've been through this a lot. I think the defence is that I think that Britain wasn't in the position to borrow significantly more and spend significantly more. And if we had, we would have been in real trouble when COVID hit.
Okay, other countries did and seemed to do fine. Let's move on.
Good. Now, Alistair, a question for you, much more jolly question for you, getting off the tough stuff of economics. We have a question on Harry Kane. Andrew, given Harry Kane's response to a question about ex-players criticising the efforts of the current crop, what's that? Is that your friend and my friend Gary Lineker criticising?
Yeah, I'll do you an explainer in a minute.
Good. Do you have any misgivings about passing judgment on the performance of current politicians as they try to grapple with problems which may have perplexed you in the past? Alistair?
This relates to the fact that Gary Lineker, on a very, very good podcast called The Rest is Football, which may well be related to The Rest is Politics, used the S word, which for Gary, S-H-I-T, to describe the performance of England.
I thought you were going to say splendid or stupendous.
No. He said they were shit, which of course he wouldn't say on Match of the Day because that would have to be bleeped.
Yeah.
And Harry Kane, England captain, was asked about this. I've got to say, I thought Harry Kane's response was very, very good. It was very measured. He said that a lot of the players did listen to pundits, and especially those pundits who were former players that they all respected. And he just said, I think they should bear in mind that there was a time when, they were on the receiving end of criticism and it's not nice, etc. Anyway, but it really, really was a big deal. When I was in Paris yesterday, I picked up a copy of L'Équipe, the French sports paper, and there it was, Kane répond à la critique de l'unicaire. It was like, it's become quite a big story.
Wait, for international listeners, just help us here. I mean, was Gary Lineker actually right before we get into the details of the response?
The general view of England's performance was that they were not at their best. They were a long way off their best. The general view of the European media is that it is only because of our media that England gets talked up so much. So unless they beat everybody 8-0, it's kind of like it's all a terrible disappointment. But no, I think Gary Lineker had a point. I also think Harry Kane had a point. But the question to us, I don't feel at all bad about passing judgment on the current government, because it's like basically Diego Maradona passing judgment on players from Hartlepool United youth team. It's like, this lot are so bad. But this is more a question for you because of your book, because of course you were very, very critical of people that you'd worked with, which I sort of try to avoid sometimes.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I noticed I was on a stage in Oxford on Sunday being interviewed by a friend of ours called Tom Fletcher, who was a diplomat.
Very good diplomat.
Yep. And he, to be cheeky, he texted you to ask for a question to ask me, and you asked me to name a player in the Burnley team. But he also texted David Cameron, and David Cameron immediately texted back saying, "That's not one for me." And I think what's happened there is that I have really alienated David Cameron.
That's why he won't come on the podcast.
By the way I've written about him. Yeah, and he won't come on the podcast. By the way I've written about him in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I think because politics matters to so much of our lives, because governments are spending nearly £1 trillion. They do our health, our education, roads. And because it's democracy, people have a real right to actually know what's going on inside. But it's a difficult choice because they're also my colleagues and they will feel that I'm betraying confidences. And it's certainly true at this point, which you must have experienced a lot when you were in government, which is that it's very easy to criticize from the outside. I was speaking to a really amazing guy who's had an incredible record and grew up in poverty, but he gave me 45 minutes on the phone about everything the government's doing wrong and everything Labour's doing wrong. And of course, it's very difficult for me not to bristle a bit and get a bit defensive and saying, well, maybe it's not as easy as that. So he was like, we need to completely abolish the treasury. We need to, do, if only you spent more money stopping poverty in childhood, then you wouldn't have to spend money later. And so it's that weird sense where someone's saying something which is true, but you're thinking it's much more difficult. And just to come back to Harry Kane for a second, I guess, what would be his, apart from the fact that he thinks Gary Lineker is being mean, he must also think that there's something that Gary Lineker doesn't quite get, and at some level that Gary Lineker wouldn't be able to do much better a job if he was managing the England team.
Well, he did point out that Gary's generation didn't win anything, but he did it very, very, very gently. No, I think what's happened, and friend enough, I had a call yesterday from the Daily Telegraph who said they were doing a big piece about how podcasts in sport seem to be where the kind of the mood is being created now, almost as much as the papers. So like Gary, and obviously Gary Lineker, Alan Shearer, Michael Richards, they're big pundits anyway. Their voice kind of carries some weight. But I was struck in Germany when I was out there, just how much when you're talking to managers, whether they're managers, who are currently involved or past managers, how many of the conversations sort of flow around what the pundits are saying. Roy Keane sort of says something and they all go, do you see what Roy Keane said? He played for Manchester United in the Republic of Ireland, by the way, Roy, just in case you'd never heard of him. So I think that the other thing that happens, people always use this phrase about, inside the Westminster bubble, but those bubbles are the same in football squads as well. So they sort of take it very, 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 very personally. But I find sometimes that I think in a way you are more outspoken about some of your colleagues than I am. I sometimes get criticised, not least by Fiona, saying you're far too soft on Labour. You get a question every week from somebody saying, do you still think Gillian Keegan's great? Because I think she's rubbish. And that, I guess, is about friendship. And fun enough, we both got involved in an interesting one. As you know, I've always had a pretty good relationship with Johnny Mercer, Veterans Minister. last week I really lost it with him and went for him on social media because he did, I thought, a very, very unfair attack on his Labour opponent, Fred Thomas, frankly casting doubt over his integrity as a soldier. And I think if you're the Veterans Minister, that is a wrong thing to do. So I called it out, and he sent me some very unpleasant messages.
And then you asked me to support you on this, and I thought, okay, this is a tough one, but I agree with Alistair on this, and this is my friend and colleague, but I'll come out and say I passionately agree with Alistair on this. And Johnny was then unbelievably cross with me too.
Yeah. So these things are you do weigh them up. But ultimately, I thought in our interview with Alex Chaw, which I really recommend to people, I was a bit dubious about Alex Chaw because, he's not that well known. And he's, as you said, he's a bit of a central casting sort of Tory politician. But I actually thought it was a really interesting interview. And I thought the thing he said, I was really surprised. I think my first question was, how many real friends do you have in politics? And he basically said maximum 4 or 5.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very, very interesting. I think that, and it's true in politics, I think friendship, you have to be very, very careful. And ultimately, Johnny Mercer probably thinks that was unfair on him. But I think if I see, and obviously I am tribal and I am Labour, I see a Labour candidate being attacked unfairly, my instinct is to defend the Labour guy rather than the Tory guy.
A lot of this is also because you're working very closely with people. I've seen Alex Chalk under pressure, and I saw him take a very brave line on trying to fight for the EU customs union when the whole party was against that and working with me on that. I've seen Gillian Keegan under pressure and being forced to try to endorse Boris Johnson and holding off from that, sticking with me. So a lot of it is about
it's about your own experience.
Your experience of them and their integrity. And do they hold the line? And I'm afraid often the people that I'm most brutal about, and this is part of the problem, sadly, with Johnny Mercer, who's got many, many virtues, but it was his decision to give a softball question to Boris Johnson at the key moment when Boris Johnson was about to fall. First question in Prime Minister's questions, when I felt he should have been standing up and saying, "You are a disgrace, resign." He bowled him a softball question and was made the Veterans Minister. And I thought, whoa, hold a second. No, there's another thing going on though. I mean, I don't, given that Johnny's now decided he hates me and is going to start slagging me off, let me start another thing that I think is a theme that has been raised. And this is a question from Bob, which has come in, which is, do we think we should have more soldiers in politics? And this is a big issue in the US. There's huge political action campaigns, which are just about funding, getting more veterans into politics. And I'm a bit divided on this. There were 51, I think, members of Parliament in the Conservative Party when I was there who had been in the army, even if they'd just been there for a very short period like me. We all turn up to Remembrance Day services together. But some of them, like Bob Stewart, was a kind of full colonel who'd spent an entire career in the military. But I'm not sure that it's always the answer. And I think there's a risk that if you've been in the military and you've seen combat, you begin to think that's the most important thing in the world. And it's the thing that really makes you better than other people. And there's a risk that you end up, kind of looking down on other people purely on whether or not they happen to have been shot at or not. And I'm not sure that's a very good guarantee of how well you run the country.
No, there are. I think Bob Stewart is a very good example. Seems to have had a very good reputation in the military, but I don't think does have a very good reputation in politics. Labour have 14 ex-military candidates at this election, and that's obviously part of Keir Starmer's sort of de-Corbynification of the party. Now, Rory, we had a question. We have a lot of very, very well-known people listen to our podcast, and here's a question that came in from one Josh Widdicombe.
Hello, Rory. Hello, Alistair. Big fan of the podcast. And I've got a question for you, which is, because I've always wondered this. When you become the Prime Minister, presumably you stay up all night, right, on election night. How late do you first get to go back to bed? Because surely then the next day you've got to go and see the Queen, you've got to talk to presidents, you've got to do all this kind of thing. How many days is Keir Starmer going to have to kick through before he gets to go to bed? Or do they have a nap on the night? Surely they're too excited, aren't they? Can't wait to hear. Cheers, guys. Love the pod.
Well, I suppose it depends on them. I remember in 97 and I think 2001, I think Tony Blair tried to have a nap during the day, pretty much failed. Yes, stayed up through the night, flew back to London, went to Festival Hall. I think he got home and had about 2 hours sleep. And then the next day probably got to bed about midnight. So yeah, it's a long, long, long night.
Isn't there a famous anecdote, Alistair, I know it's in your diaries, of a rock star saying to Tony, you stayed all the way through the night like me, and Tony saying, you remember that?
Yeah, it was Noel Gallagher, and it was saying, how do you stay up through the night? And Tony said, well, not using the same stuff that you do. So yeah, but it is. But we're going to be doing the same thing because we're going to be doing Channel 4. By the way, I see they've announced today that they're having. I hope you're under anaesthetic, Rory. I don't want you to fall off your chair. Apparently, Nadine Dorries is going to be one of our guests.
This is going to be tough.
Yeah, that'll be tough. Maybe we should take a break.
Maybe we should take our nap.
Our mid-program. Anyway, Josh, you're absolutely right.
Certainly, somebody listening to the program. I was making a joke about ice baths. Somebody's actually offered to bring an ice bath into the Channel 4 studio for you.
Okay, not a Lido.
Help you make it. No, it's not a whole.
The only thing I say, Rory, because I worry about every time I go on a television program, I worry about how down market are they going to try and take it. Right? We are not taking our clothes off. Okay,
we're not taking our clothes off.
We're just
not. So I had to take my clothes off. I went on Saturday to go swimming in the Serpentine.
Yeah.
And of course, when I went swimming in the Serpentine Swimming Club in Hyde Park, literally everybody came bubbling up to me and be like, "Oh, you're taking after Alistair. Is this wonderful?" etc. So there we are.
Now listen, Nicky Robson, how can we shift the focus in our media so that we become better informed about policies, data and evidence rather than the semi-sensationalist gotcha gossip? Now that does feel, Rory, like an invitation for me to plug my books for children, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. No, we're always looking for those opportunities.
We are looking for those. But also, basically, our very good friends at the New European have bought shed loads of the book for new subscriptions. You will get, if you're a new subscriber to the New European, you get both books signed by me, free of charge, savings of millions of pounds, and you sign up for as little as £1 a week to the New European at theneweuropean.co.uk/trip. And if you use that as an opportunity to plug your bloody books, one of which is still at number one, okay, I'll be very pissed off.
That's what. And Alistair, I'm gonna take this opportunity to quickly show everybody the beautiful new covers on my series. 1 second.
Oh no, he's intolerable. This is intolerable.
And here we come. Okay, so I've talked about this new series of 4. So this is Politics on the Edge.
Yeah, I read that
one.
But
now, for the first time, you can get all 4 of them same cover. So that's the marches.
Yeah, that's nice.
Occupational hazards, which
I like the uniform covers. Yeah, I like that.
And the places in between. So it's now become a 4-volume series where, if you want, you can go walk across Afghanistan, do Iraq,
Scotland,
do Scotland and Cumbria,
and then do politics. Excellent. That's great. I wish somebody would do all 8 volumes of my diaries in that way, but the trouble is I've got 2 publishers.
Are they all different? They all slightly different covers?
They're a bit different, yeah. But anyway, we've moved on from that. Shall we stop plugging and get back to?
Yeah. Well, let's get back to that question about. We had a good question on facts and figures and politics. So I was really struck by the Green Party manifesto, which was the only one that really tried to concentrate on the media. So it's committed to the second stage of the Leveson report, which we've talked about a little bit. Maybe we can touch on that for a second. Those are reforms that came in after the phone hacking scandal.
Yeah.
And they've also brought in quite an interesting idea in their manifesto of limiting the holdings of anyone to only 25% of a media company. So you can't have a controlling majority ownership.
As individual isolated policies, I'd be happy with both. However, Rory, you cannot get away from the fact that their economic policies do not stand up.
Okay, but let's just take those as individual isolated policies. I think it would be a great help. We talk a lot about the media. Are there any other things that we can do? I mean, obviously, I had a slightly long and boring bit at the beginning about the tax burden and who's pays for it. But I think it's quite interesting sometimes, facts and figures like that. The question is, how does one really make them come alive? How do you sell newspapers while also communicating some slightly nuanced stuff? Any thoughts on that?
The thing is, you talked about Paul Johnson of the IFS, and he did a speech the other day. It shows how weird the debate has become, that a speech by Paul Johnson of the IFS about how the parties weren't telling the truth about the economy was kind of covered like big news on the television. And the parties didn't even really bother responding. So, oh, well, he's going to say that, but let's just ignore it because. And so they all kind of know that there's a bit of a game going on. But here's a great question, I thought, from James Merkin. Why is there no requirement in electoral law that requires all election material to be factual and auditable? I sent you a thing, Rory. I don't know if you saw it. It was these adverts that the Tories are putting out on social media and sending to people on WhatsApp and so forth. They're a bit like your books. There's a set of 4, and they're 4 Labour will. Unless you vote Tory, Labour will. And then there are 4 statements which are factually untrue. Now, if they were advertising, if that was Coke advertising the product, the consequences of buying Pepsi, they would be subject to all sorts of punishment. If that was a car saying, BMW, buy BMW because Volkswagen, is unsafe. But why is politics exempt from this? And it only works if this freedom of speech thing is matched by people basically committing to tell the truth.
You're absolutely right. We're going to have to tighten this up. I guess the thing that you've got to guard against when you tighten it up, so I'm not disagreeing with you, but the thing you've got to guard against is that when countries start putting more and more laws around this, you then end up with parties using the law against each other. So that's why in Bangladesh, 1.2 million members of the opposition, as we said, are currently under judicial scrutiny.
Yeah.
That's why, Modi in India will go after his opponents for judicial stuff. You can see it in Latin America. So in Britain, the disadvantage of our system is that people can get away with lies. The advantage of the system is that you don't end up in this world in which parties very, very quickly start weaponizing these laws against each other as a way of getting each other locked up or taking each other's campaign finances away or disqualifying each other in the election campaign. But you're right, many of the things in Britain we don't have laws about because we've tended to depend on what Simon Cooper in his latest book calls the good chap theory of politics, which is increasingly under strain.
Yeah, no, I've been surprised that we all knew Johnson was a liar. We all knew Truss was useless, but I have been genuinely surprised at Rishi Sunak, who gets these lines and he just keeps going. So again, last night, the £2,000 tax thing, it's been refuted, rebutted, dismissed by experts, etc. But he just keeps going with it. And I think it's a problem. I think it's a real problem for our politics. I think it's one of the reasons that turnout probably is going to be low, that people just aren't trusting, that they're less trusting than they were about statements. And it goes back to this thing about shamelessness. People are not ashamed now. So let's just take, Nigel Farage and his recent statements. He's trying to kind of finesse and rewrite things that he said because he realizes that this Putin-Ukraine stuff has become politically damaging to him for the current circumstance. And I just think it's, unless you can base it, and let's face it, the thing that people say they like about Farage, says what he thinks and what have you. Well, no, I think sometimes he doesn't because he's finessing. And Sunak, I've been genuinely surprised by how much he's willing to lie.
And the terrible thing, of course, is that the worse that people behave, the more it becomes normalized.
Absolutely.
So I think this betting scandal, which has, of course, really shocked and angered people, but probably would have been even more shocking kind of pre-Boris Johnson.
But Rory, here's another one. The other day, there was this story about how the Conservatives, and lots of big-name Conservatives, including Truss, I think, that they'd used public money to set up websites that were there to serve them as party candidates. And also there's this stuff about where you get data through your role as an MP, which is then transferred into, and I know John Mann has been big on this. Now, that is just wrong.
That is wrong. And actually, Conservatives may be poor offenders, but I've also seen other parties do it too. It was something that became obvious when we came in 2010. So as an MP, you're in a very ambiguous relationship with your constituents. On the one hand, you're kind of doing constituency surgeries. You're obviously receiving, I would receive, I think, 25,000 emails a year. So you've got everybody's email and their data and all this kind of stuff. And of course, you're given money to send letters to your constituents, correspond with them, ask them questions.
Yeah.
But all these MPs, well, not all of them, many of them, start using that public money to do things which are pretty close to campaigning. And this line between, which you would have come across again and again when you were in government, what's the line between what you can do in the government and what
And
you
what's the
can
party?
do
Yeah,
in party.
yeah.
And I remember, this sort of stuff that you and Richard Wilson would go head to head on.
Yeah, and but I was always very, very careful. But every now and again, I would probably cross the line. I remember once he came in and after I'd done a briefing and said, "Look, you said something there about Ken Livingstone, which you shouldn't have said because that was totally a party matter. It had nothing to do with the government." And I corrected that and accepted I shouldn't have done that. But now it's almost like, well, the lines have become so blurred post Johnson. Now, Rory, we talked on the main podcast about this betting scandal. We got a question literally about 10 minutes after we finished recording. And we'd been saying, Sunak, for heaven's sake, why hasn't he suspended these candidates? They then became suspended. So Mark has asked, can the Tories take the suspended candidates back into the party as MPs if they're elected? And this is the mess that Sunak's got himself into. These people are on the ballot paper as Conservative Party candidates. They've had the whip withdrawn, whatever that means, because there's no parliament sitting at the moment. If they win and they are proven to have done this betting stuff, which Sunak says he's absolutely furious about, then no, they'll have to sit as independents.
The big question came up again in Rochdale, where again the Labour candidate made some very offensive comments. Keir Starmer suspended him. If he'd been elected, Keir Starmer would have had to decide whether or not eventually he'd let this guy back into the Labour Party or whether he'd have to keep him out. Yeah, this is a really good question because in Rochdale by-election, the same thing happened. The Labour candidate who was on the ballot paper, and it was too late to remove him, made some very offensive comments. Keir Starmer then said this person's no longer in the Labour Party, and if he'd been elected, Keir Starmer would have had to work out what to do with him. But there's a sort of bigger question, which is why, given that Rishi Sunak's now done it, didn't he do it sooner? And this is a mistake that both he and Keir Starmer have made in the past, which is, Keir Starmer's example was pretty clear that he needed to let Diane Abbott run. But he tried for many days to say there's a process here, there's a system here, I can't get involved. And then eventually he's like, okay, Diane Abbott can run. And again, Rishi Sunak tried to say there's a process here, there's a system here, I can't suspend them. And then eventually he has to suspend them. They're not good enough. What is it that stops them kind of grabbing the nettle quickly enough rather than eventually doing what they should have done all along?
I think the Diane Abbott situation is slightly different. I think what was going on there was that Diane Abbott was in discussion with the Labour Party and that somebody briefed something out that she took real offence to, and that created the row, which they then tried to calm. I think this one is just about Sunak doesn't have good political instincts. And, let's be honest, the other thing I'd say for Labour, listen, they fought a pretty good campaign and they haven't really dropped a ball badly. It's all gone pretty well. But the thing that happens when you get in, if Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister, I once remember saying that, sometimes I would be sitting alongside Tony Blair and you feel like you're a batsman and you're facing like not one fast bowler, you're facing about 20 fast bowlers at the same time because so many things are coming at you. And so many of them, you have to make a decision really, really quickly to stop something which may not be that important becoming a real issue. By the way, Rory, literally as we're
give
talking...
us an example. Sorry, just give us an example before we get to literally while we're talking.
I'll give you an example. During the middle of a build-up to a military conflict, when the big decision was about whether we were sending troops or not, we had the whole one of Peter Mandelson's resignation situations. And, Peter, I think to this day thinks that we were too brutal. But in a way, I think part of the thinking is one way or the other, this has got to get off Tony Blair's desk so they can actually focus on the things that he really has to do.
And also, presumably, Alistair, you would have had an instinct that he's going to have to go anyway. So we might as well get rid of him now rather than letting it drag on for days as the witch hunt builds and the newspapers go after
Well,
him.
it sort of went on a fair time anyway. But I think other times, like, for example, I can remember at European summits when suddenly stuff would break at home and you have to make a very quick decision. Are we going to do this? By the way, as we're speaking, Rory, the BBC have just done breaking news. The Gambling Commission has told the Metropolitan Police 5 further police officers are alleged to have placed bets related to the timing of the election.
So it's not just Rishi Sunak's inner circle, it's also the Metropolitan Police, have nothing to do with the Conservative Party, and presumably it's the Diplomatic Protection Police, who are the elite, who are meant to be confident. But it's just such a sign, I don't care who's doing it, of just everything becoming kind of trivialized. Without being really kind of pompous about it, you cannot imagine this happening. I just got an email from someone in Japan saying you literally cannot imagine this happening in Japan. And if they did, people would be resigning immediately. I mean, people would feel it was so dishonorable. Yeah.
Let's just get back to this betting theme, though, because I was with you, Rory, on the day that you were trying to place a bet with an entire railway carriage.
That's
and
it.
it's a bloody good job that you didn't.
Yeah, because I was betting against this. I know I would have lost big time.
You were trying to do some outsider trading.
At least the fact that I lost would have suggested I didn't have inside trading. Yeah. Listen, I did just finally on the Mandelson thing, because I think this may relate to what's happening with Rishi Sunak and Craig Williams. Probably if you were really brutal and an outsider, you would say, actually, you and Tony Blair held on to Peter Mandelson for longer than you should have done and let it play out in the witch hunts bill in the press. And the reason you did it is that he was a close friend and you felt loyalty towards him. And if he hadn't been a close friend, you might have been able to see clearly and more objectively.
Possibly. That's possibly true.
And I'm sure the same's true here, that this man, Craig Williams, has been Rishi Sunak's closest parliamentary aide. And therefore, it's very human, isn't it? Your loyalty, your friendships cloud things, and you can be more objective and more brutal with people that you know less well.
I think that's right. But this one, you're in the middle of an election campaign. The minute this happened, Rishi Sunak should have said, sorry, this is under no circumstances going to happen. It's not going to be tolerated. I'm sorry. Even at the risk of losing that seat to an independent, even at the risk of that seat going to another candidate, you are not representing the Conservative Party.
And even at the risk that you might actually be innocent, because this is one of the things some of these people say, I didn't do it. Oh, it's not actually the case with Craig Williams.
He admitted he put the bet on.
But there's this great line that Julius Caesar produces where he distances himself from his wife, and his wife says, I didn't actually cheat on you. And he says, even the suspicion that you've done it is enough for me to distance myself.
I still think he was the author of the greatest ever soundbite.
Go on, what's that then?
Veni, vidi, vici.
Do you use that a lot?
It's the best ever.
It's the best.
It's better than education.
European Pal, what are your takes, or actually, Alistair, what is your take on the release of Julian Assange?
Well, I was on breakfast television this morning, and obviously this came up, and I was on Good Morning Britain, and Kevin Maguire from the Mirror, Andrew Pearce of the Mail, and it was very interesting to watch because you got the two views. Andrew Pearce, basically, this guy's awful. He's a friend of terrorists. He's a hater of the West. He's not a real journalist, etc. And Kevin Maguire, much more, this guy exposed things that were wrong, and that was an act of public service, and that he's been very, very unfairly treated. I am not a fan of Julian Assange. I think that in dumping all the stuff that he did, I think he did so without going through what I would call proper journalistic endeavour. I think some of the newspapers he was working with might well have done so, but I don't think that he did. And I also feel very uncomfortable that the sexual charges against him in relation to Sweden, one of which I believe was dropped because the time ran out, which he's always denied. I accept he's always denied it. But it wasn't just that he was avoiding justice in America, the fact that he was avoiding justice in Sweden as well. And I think that a deal has been done. He's now on his way to freedom, I guess, in Australia. But I feel very, very uncomfortable, both with the fact that I accept Kevin Maguire made this point that he did expose things that were very, very wrong, which might not otherwise have been exposed. That is true. And there is a public interest justification for that. There is not a public interest justification for some of the stuff that I think put people's lives at risk. What's your view? What's your view?
I'm avoiding Julian Assange. I find the whole thing really weird, but I think your correct framing is good. I think there is a public interest defense in revealing stuff. I do believe in transparency in government, but I think that Assange seems to have been often reckless, often not really motivated by trying to bring truth to government, and appears to have sort of had an anarchic, destructive tendency to him. But I don't know enough about Assange, and I feel a bit out on a limb saying that. Political cartoons, James Butler. Satirical cartoons. Have you or any members of your family kept any of yourselves? Have any particularly irked you?
I've got loads, and I wish I had more.
You like them? I mean, I've got a lot, and have been given a lot of me, and I hate them. I hide them. I don't really want people to see them because I don't know what to do with them. Because I think it's kind of, Either they're flattering, in which case it looks like you've got a massive big head putting up in your loo, pictures yourself in a flattering cartoon. So there's one of me when I was running for the leadership of me hopping over the heads of all the other candidates. There are others that are just sort of faintly humiliating. So there was one of me, again, during the leadership where I'm one of 5 tiny candidates on a desert island with Boris Johnson as this huge, fat, pink balloon, ever expanding, pushing us into the water. And then the one that really annoyed me when I was running for mayor of London was me on a camel in ridiculous kind of Lawrence of Arabia garb, and Boris Johnson sitting there like a sort of enormous, sort of cliched pasha with a hubble bubble pipe, saying something like, "I'm supposed to be the only entitled, ridiculous old Etonian," flouncing off as I rode off on my camel.
That's quite good. I actually wish I had more. I've got lots and lots stashed away. I've got about 20 that are hung in different parts of the house, particularly bathrooms. People do like seeing them as they're sort of, in the bathroom having a pee or whatever. And they don't know me at all. I mean, there was the guy in the Daily Mirror always used to do me as Frankenstein with 2 bolts through my neck. There was another guy who used to do me as this kind of really evil, manipulative looking, rather haggard, gaunt character. I always found them quite funny. And there's another one that I've got downstairs where Tony, who they always did. This was Charles Griffin. And he did Tony like really ugly, massive bags under his eyes. His teeth were all kind of out of position and out of place. And he's standing at the top of the plane steps, and he goes, "Here," and this was just after the Kosovo liberation, and he goes, "Here I am landing in this benighted land, everything reduced to rubble, greeted as a hero." And I'm in the background as Dracula saying, "Boss, this isn't Pristina, this is Middlesbrough."
It's good. So I think one of the great ones that against me was Matt, who's the Daily Telegraph cartoonist, at a time when I was being portrayed in the newspapers as a kind of sort of mini messiah who was going to become prime minister, and my colleagues were beginning to think of me as a sort of massive narcissist. So it's an image of the House of Commons terrace and the River Thames. And all my colleagues are on the terrace looking over, and I'm walking on the water down the centre of the Thames with, look, it's Rory Stewart on his latest walkabout.
Well, look, Rory, I think on you as Jesus, we should call a halt to another question time.
Oh, Alistair, lovely to see you, and thank you for coming on.
See you soon.
Bye bye.